everyone, and thank you for joining our Metaverse Day promotional speaker spotlight with Jonah Jones, who'll be joining us on the 24th and 25th of January for the exciting conversation about the emerging metaverse, spatial computing, whatever the terminology you want to choose when you talk about this. We'll be digging into that now. But a big welcome to Jonah Jones. Jonah, would you like to give us a quick introduction to yourself and a bit about your background?
Hi, Miles. Pleasure to chat with you. I've kind of got a background at the intersection of product and design and engineering. I studied computer science, but design was always my passion. I worked at a bunch of different startups in London for a long time before joining Google as one of the first designers outside of the US. I worked for 7 years nearly on Google Maps, going from designing individual features to becoming a manager and then becoming a leader. And we ended up doing one of the biggest redesigns of Google history. I then joined Meta, then Facebook, and I had a few different teams. So I was leading product design for their sharing set of tools. That was very interesting because that was basically going from a 2 billion to a 2 billion and one problem, getting people to share more stuff. At the same time, I was leading product design for Workplace, which is a version of Facebook you use inside a company. And that was interesting because that was going from a 0 to 1 problem, because every time you deploy to a new company, no one's using it. And then I also worked on one of their ads products called Audience Network, which is trying to get basically better ads inside things that are not Facebook, things like Candy Crush Saga. And that was a $2 billion business, so there's lots of twos. And then I spent the final 2 years working at what was then Oculus, working on, basically we had this future explorations team, and we were exploring what the future of augmented reality and virtual reality and mixed reality would be in a kind of 2 to 10 year time frame. So we did lots of stuff with hardware and with software, and that obviously a lot of that stuff is beginning to come true now, both on the Meta side and on the Apple side and everything else. So it's really exciting to be talking about that stuff.
How have you seen this industry landscape shifting across your trajectory in these different roles, these big giant enterprises? And what are some of the key considerations we can think about as this landscape continues to emerge?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So my team was working on this before the whole metaverse, before Meta rebranded to Meta, and before the metaverse thing kind of really became in the common parlance, and nobody still really knows what that is because everyone defines it differently. So we used to call it spatial computing back then, just because we would find it really difficult getting people from traditional design, because most stuff is done in 2D. Obviously, all the screens we're using on our computers and phones and everything else in 2D. And we would find the key difference is moving that into the three-dimensional world requires like a different way of thinking and a different set of design skills. So I was hiring architects and other people who are used to thinking spatially. And I think that ultimately is what is going to be interesting, is that the first thing that you think of inevitably when you think of like breaking outside of this screen that we're looking at now is like, well, I could have an infinitely large TV screen, or I could have like I could make my wall a virtual whiteboard and start doing some stuff. But we naturally, I think in 2 dimensions, because we're thinking of an extension of the current things that we're doing today. I think that's all going to be great, and this Apple device will be a much nicer monitor than one you can afford even for that same quite high price and everything else. But I think that really is just the beginning and the things that will feel familiar to people. And what will be interesting is when we start moving beyond that, because a lot of the work we do today is 2D, but a lot of the work that happens, especially non-digital, is in the 3 dimensions, and we're 3-dimensional creatures, and we're used to interacting with each other, especially pre-pandemic, even more so, by sharing a space and interacting and taking visual cues and all this other stuff. So I think that the key thing for me when people are saying, what is the metaverse and all this other stuff, I think it's just like, rather than the internet being stuck on this mobile phone and stuck behind a little screen, is that it really, the promise of this is that it will be all around you and truly integrated into the world around you, rather than being ignorant of it. And so I think that we're starting, really on that journey, but it's going to be a long journey.
Well, 100%. I don't think we're nearly there yet, right? There's early emergence, and speaking of these emergence on the market and these products that are coming, becoming available commercially, Apple are obviously now moving into the space. Apple don't do things lightly, right, when it comes to new product launches. So what are your thoughts? And I know you're not working or, endorsing any Apple products necessarily, but what are your kind of just personal perspectives on Apple providing this kind of movement into the space and their hardware? What do you think of that?
I think that this Apple entrance into the market is very exciting and interesting, and I think it's interesting because it's one of the few, if not the only time I can ever think of that Apple have announced something that's a year out, not at a consumer price point, clearly not aimed at a consumer market, and doesn't really have a kind of single killer obvious use case. I think they're basically putting this thing out there to just figure out like what are people going to use on this thing. They obviously have high conviction and feel that it's going to be powerful, but nobody quite knows what this thing is for yet. So in that way, it's almost a bit more like an Apple Watch or something. So I have high conviction in this space, but I don't know if obviously this device is not going to be the end device. So I think that, when you look at the price point and everything, Apple have done really quite an amazing thing, but it carries a price point with it, and they're starting at what they probably believe to be a minimum viable experience, and they're going to gradually work toward a minimum viable price point. And then you've got Meta, who have always been operating at the level of, ultimately Meta is a social company. It's about connecting people and humans. It's not going to work if no one can afford the device. So Meta always work at a minimum viable price point and then work toward what will be a minimum viable consumer product. So we're basically seeing Apple and Meta doing the same thing, kind of, but from different angles. They will eventually meet in the middle, and then when that happens, it'll be really interesting, because then you'll start to really see the power of Apple and Meta, which are very powerful in different things. Meta understands people and humans and interactions and all of this stuff. So anything kind of social, I imagine Meta will do better. And then Apple have, superb vertical integration and like integration of all their hardware and software and everything playing nicely in the Apple garden, but maybe not outside. They're definitely complementary right now because they're operating different price points, and Meta's got gaming and social and stuff, and Apple are going after productivity. But even when they start overlapping, I think they'll still be somewhat complementary because they're kind of going to be for different people that value different things. But yeah, that's the journey, I think.
Yeah, it'll be an exciting few years for sure. And so you're a product and design leader, right? That's your lens, and design is the passion. And you'll be talking about this marriage of hardware and software, because that's obviously working with Oculus. That was a really playground you were working in, right? And but in your experience, how critical is this sort of tight interplay between hardware capabilities and software functionality?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical, but just because nobody really is buying software. Even like people have a need that they want met. Either it's a functional one or a utilitarian one or an entertainment one or whatever. You have a need, then you get some software to hopefully fulfill that need, and then that software runs on some hardware. So then you hopefully get the hardware to run the software to fulfill the need. So some of us nerds actually buy hardware because we think it's cool, but most normal people, they don't buy the hardware or even the software. They just have a need that they want filled. And so I think that these things the interplay is interesting because obviously better hardware enables more use cases and more interesting software that can answer more interesting problems. But the hardware also is, of course, driven by what problems are interesting, what problems are valuable. So that these are very interesting, and that was exactly actually what my team was doing at Meta. Was we were looking at all of the amazing hardware and software that was coming out of these research labs that felt a bit like being in a James Bond or Iron Man movie, and then figuring out all this amazing stuff, what actually is going to answer real problems that real people have, and how do we make that play together? So I think the interplay between this hardware and the software is very interesting. Ultimately, nobody quite knows what the killer use case is yet. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here speaking to each other. We'd be on a boat sipping cocktails somewhere. So like that is the thing that needs to be figured out. But you get the hardware out there, you see what people do, and then you see what the next version of the hardware needs to either have more of some things or maybe less of another thing to make it more affordable. It's going to be that kind of bouncing between the walls until we find the place.
At the moment, would you be of the opinion we're somewhat in the place of creating a solution before the needs, or do you think the needs is there?
I think that there are an absolute ton of unmet needs in the world right now. And then I think spatial computing has the potential to unlock a whole bunch of things. Like, as I say before, these Zoom calls are kind of annoying and awkward because you're flat and I'm flat, and it feels like we're captive, and it's like rude to look away and walk around and all this other stuff, and all the calls look the same because we're all stuck in the same room staring at the same pixels. So like on almost any use case you can think of, and I'll use this as an example, it's much nicer if it feels like we're actually like inhabiting the same space. You feel like you're next to me. Perhaps we can go for a walk. Perhaps we can change, so we're going to be outside instead of inside. Perhaps this conversation will feel actually different to the last one I had because we'll be in a different place or surrounded by inspiration all around us about metaverse stuff. Or maybe if we're if we're having a banking conversation, we'll be surrounded by numbers or something. So I think that in almost any realm you can think of, there are we can all imagine what would be like a vastly better experience by tearing away from the screen and moving all around us, but also like having some depth and some sense of real reality and even intimacy. Like, us sitting closer together is very different than us sitting further apart. And you can't quite get the same thing on the camera, even though my hand's getting bigger and smaller here. So, that example follows through to almost everything we can think of. And then there's obvious ones in like military and manufacturing where you want to be hands-free, and depth is a really important part of it. You're not just looking at a spreadsheet or typing letters. Education, a gazillion different ways that we can imagine that this thing will be helpful. And then it's just about like bridging that gap between the future that we imagine, the optimistic future that we imagine, and like what's the hardware and the software, and like all of the user education and trust and policies and privacy and all the other stuff that we've got to figure out to kind of get there, and without hopefully entering the dystopian version of the future that everyone also fears as well. So I'm bullish on, I don't think this is like hardware in search of a problem. I think there are real opportunities here, but like it's just about finding our way there in the right way.
So let's talk about that technology a bit further then. So we've got, XR is this kind of catch-all phrase for different types of spatial experience. And that breaks down to, augmented and virtual reality as these kind of two key topics. And then in the middle is like this mixed reality environment. So looking ahead, I mean, what do you see as the roadmap for technologies like AR and VR? And also I'd like to feed into this discussion about the geospatial metaverse as well, because I think it's quite interesting, a distinction for people to understand that when we talk about AR and VR and as a technology.
Yeah, I think these three use cases of virtual reality and mixed reality and augmented reality in their kind of truest form, where like VR is a TV on your face, MR is a TV on your face with a video camera as well, so you can see a live video feed, and like AR is like your glasses, you're looking at the real world and you're beaming some stuff. Now, of course, this whole thing gets a bit muddied because Apple are calling their thing AR. Technically, it's MR. Maybe actually it's AR, and it's AR enough that's all it gets to. But I think what's interesting about them is they enable different things. So a really good virtual experience where like most of the pixels are not real, enables you to do escapism or training or all these different things where you're enabling something that would have been very difficult or impossible or very expensive to do in the real world. You're enabling that experience. So like pretend I'm up in space training to be an astronaut, or pretend I'm under the Great Barrier Reef and it's back in time before it was bleached, and let me swim around in it and all this other stuff. Yeah. So like that's your VR one. And you got your MR one, which is like maybe I am on the factory floor and I'm assembling like a machine, and it's showing me in 3D what the next thing is I need to do, and assemble that and everything. So that's basically upgrading things that I'm already doing that are inherently spatial. And then you've got AR, and like the truest version of AR, I imagine, is one where I am in the real world. I'm engaging with real people and nature and everything else. I'm out and about. And rather than spending more time looking at a screen, hopefully we spend less time looking at a screen, because you're not having to pull out your phone and stuff, and you're just getting tiny bits of information as and when we need it. So I think that, you know, and this is why the Apple device is so interesting, because it's masquerading as augmented reality. And if you're sitting on your sofa, you kind of can't tell the difference, but you're certainly not getting up and walking around the real world and wearing the thing the whole day without looking weird yet. But maybe that does, because, you know, once they slim down, maybe your glasses are just a small pair of these things, that are 2 pairs of screens. Remains to be seen. But I do think that each of these technologies naturally kind of fits into offering a quite different benefit of either fully virtual, fully natural with a tiny bit on top, and like a pure perfect integration of virtual and physical. And then your definition of the metaverse kind of fits in with that, really. Like, there's the Ready Player One version of the metaverse where we're all a weird avatar and we're going around shooting each other, and that's fine, like a game. And then there's another one where it's the internet, but it's spatial rather than just being locked behind your phone screen. And then there's everything in between, but it's basically a spatial internet, for whatever that means for you.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. I think it's really helpful for people listening in who maybe don't have that deep understanding to get a sense of what these amorphous terms really mean. And we've got a few minutes left, and I'd really like to talk about, your lens on what these key categories for the future might look like, and I guess it relates somewhat to the technologies themselves. But you talked about when we met before, you outlined 3 categories for the future. So moments in the real world, utilitarian tasks, and escapism, I believe. And so I want to get your lens on this. How do you envision these scenarios playing out in the context of the immersive technologies themselves and this evolving metaverse?
Yeah, so I think basically, we talked about the interplay of hardware and software. If you look at what the hardware is right now, on the one hand, it's miles away from where it needs to be. On the other hand, it's absolutely incredible and has come on so far from where it is. So if you look at what the hardware right now is good enough for, it's definitely good enough for playing a really interesting video game called, for example, Beat Saber, where I'm in space and I'm with lightsabers hitting stuff. That's really cool. So that enables really, really interesting gaming. It enables like good enough social experiences that even if it's a fairly low poly avatar of you and I, the fact that we feel like we're actually sharing a space is powerful. And of course, it's enabling entertainment, well, like watching movies and that kind of thing. If you're on a movie or sitting in a small room, even today or even yesterday's technology is very good for that stuff. We're entering a world, I think, where as the resolution gets higher and the fidelity of the input gets better and the processing gets more powerful, more utility use cases become possible. Like reading gets better because like the text is crisp, which is why Apple's starting to come in with like basically this is another screen floating up here, because it will be a nice way of doing your spreadsheets because they're going to be up here. It might be a nice way of browsing the web if some of it can come in 3D. So basically utility starts to get unlocked. And then obviously you've got the military and manufacturing and education that we talked about before. And then I think basically as you start going into the future and it does start unlocking you away from your couch and your house and out into the real world, that's when a gazillion other things are going to open up as well. So I think, like depending on your use case, the future is already here or absolutely miles away, but we're basically the use cases and the things that this tech is good for is going to gradually increase as the technology and the adoption of this stuff increases. So yeah, we're just going to be on a journey. I don't think it's going to be like one day it's here. I think it is either here already or will be here at some different time, depending on the thing that you care about.
Thank you so much. Yeah. You're going to be joining us 24th and 25th of January for the upcoming event. And the panel is going to dig further into this conversation of future applications of hardware and software. And obviously you're consulting on this topic all the time now. So what will be some of the nuggets that you want to, not going into too much detail now, what are some of the nuggets that you will want to disseminate to people who are listening to this event and to that panel?
I think ultimately the There's a lot of talk about what this market might be, and like there's a lot of hype. Like everyone was going crazy about the metaverse, and then everyone forgot about it for a while when the AI took off. And people talk about market sizing and tech and hardware and all this other stuff, but none of this really matters. What actually matters is like what are the unmet needs? Where's the value that we can add to people's lives? And I think that's the interesting thing to dig into, and yeah, basically explore how far away is a future where we can start creating things that really help make the world better. And you know, AI of course plays into a lot of this as well in terms of generating virtual worlds and everything else. So I think, yeah, the devil's in the detail on this stuff, I think, rather than looking at just numbers and the hardware specs and all this other stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, look, spoke like a true designer, and finding those unmet needs. I really appreciate your time, Jonah, and we're looking forward to seeing you on the 24th and 25th. If you haven't already got a ticket, they're free, so please go and grab your ticket now, and we'll see you on the 24th and 25th. Thank you again, Jonah.
Thanks, Miles.